Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Leon Hilton. I'm an assistant professor of theater and performance studies here at Brown. I'm also one of the facilitators of the Disability Studies working group here at the Koget Institute. And it's really wonderful to have so many people here for this lecture this afternoon. I just wanted to begin by thanking so much the Koget, Amanda, Ben, Rachel, everyone for their support for the Disability Studies Working Group. It's really been wonderful to collaborate on a series of events this year. And we're particularly excited about our speaker this afternoon because part of the genesis for this event was a class that I taught with my co-introducer, Professor Jenny Lambe, a couple years ago on global histories of psychiatry and anti-psychiatry. And both of us were just really inspired by our speaker today's work. So it's really a pleasure to be having this event. So I think I'll just pass things over to Jenny, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Yes, it feels like our class has finally ended today, I think, 2 years later. So my name is Jenny Lambe. I'm an associate professor in the history department, and I'm so thrilled to welcome Camille Robcis to campus today. Professor Robcis is a professor of French and history at Columbia University, who specializes in modern European history with an emphasis on gender and sexuality, France, and intellectual, cultural, and legal history. She's the author of The Law of Kinship, Anthropology, Psychoanalysis, and the Family in France, which won the 2013 Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Book Prize, and Disalienation, Politics, Philosophy, and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France, from which she'll be speaking today. And she's currently working on a new project tentatively titled The War on Gender, which sounds absolutely fascinating. And I want to note that all three projects really persuasively foreground the dynamic and sometimes surprising interaction between theory, with a capital T, and politics, state, professional, and popular, as well as the implications of that interaction for individual bodies and minds. I have to note here that Professor Robcis received her BA, AB, in History and Modern Culture and Media from Brown, and her PhD in History from Cornell University, and she's held numerous very prestigious fellowships. I also want to add that I've had the pleasure of teaching Professor Robcis' work on several occasions, always to a very enthusiastic reception. I think this is especially appealing to those of us, students and faculty alike, who thrilled to the idea that the history of psychiatry could be more than an unfortunately sometimes all too visible series of abuses. That psychiatry could be theorized and applied as an instrument of disalienation seems in that context revelatory, and as some of my undergrads have written this week in response to her work, personally inspiring. One of them wrote, in fact, quote, "This article feels like it was written for me." With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Camille Robcis.
Thanks so much. That's the kindest introduction. I'm really so happy to be here. Thank you to the Disability Studies Working Group, to the Koget Center. As Jenny says, I was an undergrad here. In fact, my first dorm was right there around the corner. I think it still looks disheveled, but I had such a good time here. And in fact, all the people that I'm going to talk about, I first read them here, in classes. So it's really very special for me to be back here. So my talk today is based on some of the research I did for this book that came out a few years ago called Disalienation, which is basically it traces the history of a movement that was known as institutional psychotherapy. It's not an exhaustive history of institutional psychotherapy. It's also not an exhaustive history of psychiatry or radical psychiatry in post-war France, but it's more a conversation with several thinkers or psychiatrists, some philosophers who thought about the question of alienation and disalienation together. So for the next sort of 30, 40 minutes, I wanted to guide you through these 4 questions. This is kind of the structure of the talk. First of all, when did institutional psychotherapy emerge, and where? Who were the main actors in the elaboration of institutional psychotherapy? What was its central theoretical intervention? What did these doctors argue? And finally, what is the legacy, or what was the legacy, or what is the legacy of institutional psychotherapy today? So the first question, I think to understand the genesis of institutional psychotherapy, we have to go back to the history, and in particular to the Second World War when it emerged. So we're in 1940 in France. Germany just attacked France, and by June 1940, German soldiers are marching in Paris. France is split into two camps, an occupied zone and a so-called free zone, under the leadership of Philippe Pétain, who launches a national revolution to restore France's grandeur. Now, while this is happening, something that is pretty publicized at this time is what is happening in the Third Reich in psychiatric hospitals during those years. So the Third Reich had an explicit policy regarding mental illness. It openly embraced the eugenics and the forced euthanasia of those that the regime deemed the incurable sick. This is a policy that became known as Action T4 that resulted in 70,000 official deaths, but according to all accounts, the number was closer to 200,000. So Action T4 was really kind of a central piece of Hitler's program of racial purification and social regeneration. And that's received a lot of attention by historians and by people at the time. It was relatively well known. What was less well known was what was happening in French hospitals during the same years. So there's a big kind of historiographical debate about whether the Vichy regime, which was a collaborationist regime, had a policy of extermination, or whether it kind of just allowed these deaths to occur. But the point is that there was 40,000 patients who died in French psychiatric hospitals during this time. And several people, especially several doctors like this Dr. Max Lafont, talked about a soft extermination, in the sense that it wasn't like the officials were pursuing an explicit policy of extermination of the cognitively disabled, but it allowed patients to die of cold, of hunger, or lack of care within the hospitals themselves. So this is basically the context that gave rise to institutional psychotherapy, which was born in a small village here that you can see in this kind of central south France, called Saint-Alban, in the Lozère. And one psychiatric hospital tried to resist and feed its patients by hoarding food with the help of the local population. And as they were trying to basically survive the war, the doctors, the staff, who worked at Saint-Alban began to radically rethink the practical and theoretical basis of psychiatric care. So this is a picture of the hospital before the war. And I'm spending a little bit of time setting up the context here because the war was really absolutely key to bring together the cast of characters who eventually laid the groundwork for institutional psychotherapy. These included doctors, nurses, and staff, but also poets, visual artists, philosophers, and political activists who, despite their various backgrounds, shared this vision of psychiatry as a deeply political practice. So I'm going to tell you about these doctors in a moment, but first let me just mention two figures who were at Saint-Alban during the war who you might have heard of. The first one is Georges Canguilhem, the historian of science, who hid at Saint-Alban in July of 1944 while he was in the resistance, and he was actually friends from the resistance with one of the doctors, Lucien Bonafé. And in 1943, Canguilhem had defended a thesis that would eventually become his book, The Normal and the Pathological. This was an extremely important reference for institutional psychotherapy in the sense that it addressed the problem of objectivity in science, the relativity of norms, right? Canguilhem says there's no pathological without a notion of there's no normal without a notion of the pathological and vice versa. But also the social construction of diagnoses, and the relevance of what he called other forms of life. So psychosis not necessarily as a pathology, but perhaps as another form of life. So that was one person who was there. The second person is Paul Éluard, the surrealist poet, who was exiled at Saint-Alban also during the war, and who shared institutional psychotherapy's commitment to rehumanizing madness and to fight against what he called the absurd order of the world. So there was already a kind of interest in surrealism, or surrealists were already interested in the question of madness, so this kind of, the fact that he was there was built a very important bridge between this movement and madness. So for all these figures, the war and fascism had made clear the extent to which the political and the psychic were interconnected. And they were connected not just through the genocidal project that I began with, right, that I was just describing, with the extermination of the cognitively disabled, but more generally. For these doctors, fascism, authoritarianism, and collaboration were not simply political choices. They required a particular state of mind. And in that sense, key psychoanalytic concepts such as the unconscious, alienation, fantasy, desire, identification, transference could help us make sense of these political phenomena. So I'll return to these notions later, but I think the kind of context of fascism was really important to understand this movement. So for now, let me tell you a little bit about some of the people that ended up at Saint-Alban and who laid the groundwork for this movement. The most important name in the genesis of institutional psychotherapy was perhaps this character, François Tosquelles, who was not very well known until recently, but now there's a kind of editorial explosion of his work. He was a Catalan psychiatrist born in Reus, south of Barcelona, in 1912. As a student, Tosquelles participated in the vibrant Catalan political and cultural effervescence of the interwar years. And these were crucial years for the labor movement, a labor movement in which anarchism and syndicalism played a central role. Many of these groups that were kind of booming and flowering during the 30s were opposing themselves to the Spanish Communist Party, which they thought had become much too subservient to Moscow and much too uncritical of Stalinism. So some of these activists founded a group called the PUM, and this included Tosquelles, who at the time was very young, he was 24. And the PUM advocated federalism, decentralization, worker solidarity, self-management, and consciousness raising through culture. But it was especially adamant about denouncing the anti-democratic, authoritarian, and bureaucratic turn that the Soviet Union had taken in the 1930s. The PUM played a foundational role in Tosquelles' political awakening. And some of you might have heard about the PUM because it has a kind of mythical following also from George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and then Ken Loach's films also. One of his first films was about the PUM. So it only lasted a few years, but it kind of left a legacy of admirers. In several interviews, Tosquelles explained that the PUM had really basically taught him his politics, and he had taught him in particular to be wary of what he called the tout pouvoir, the all power. So for him, Stalinism was a great example of a movement that didn't start out as a kind of authoritarian, centralized dictatorial movement that eventually consolidated into Stalinism. So he called this the all power. He said, Stalin wanted the PUM to join Madrid and spread Spanish propaganda with the monarchy, the military, and power, and to say all power to the Soviets. But to accept centralization was to accept to speak Castellano, and the Castilians were our oppressors. So this is, for example, some posters of the PUM where you see that even the Catalan language for them was a way to kind of distance themselves from the Communist Party and to also reclaim a kind of regional independence. Parallel to his political activism, Tosquelles began medical school, and he chose to specialize in psychiatry. Now, psychiatry was also a kind of very up-and-coming field in Barcelona of the early 20th century, a city that was often called a little Vienna during those years because it had welcomed many psychoanalysts from Eastern Europe who had fled fascism. So this is the first hospital where Tosquelles trained in Reus, where he practiced. It's called the Peremata, and you see that the architecture is also really beautiful. It's a kind of modernist building, and the architecture will play a role in all of these experiments, right? Like using the building's architecture to rethink alienation and disalienation. This was Tosquelles' teacher, Emili Mirai Lopez, who held the first chair of psychiatry in Barcelona. He was also an avid reader of psychoanalysis, of Freud, but especially of Lacan. And it's basically it's Freud, but also the very early work of Lacan that provided many of the foundational concepts for what would later become institutional psychotherapy. More specifically, Mirai and Tosquelles read so as I said, the very early Lacan, who in 1932 had defended his thesis titled On Paranoid Psychosis and Its Relation with the Personality. Now, there's many ways to read this text, but I think, as I see it, it's a kind of manifesto for a new approach to psychiatry, a psychiatry that would be not just incorporating the insights of psychoanalysis, but really anchored in psychoanalysis. The thesis revolved around the case study of Aimé, a 38-year-old postal worker who had inexplicably tried to kill a famous actress in Paris. Lacan's main question was whether madness originated in the brain, as most neurologists believed, in the body as a kind of acquired disease, or in the social and familial worlds. His answer was clear, and I'm quoting him: "It is absurd to attribute these phenomena to a specifically neurological automatism." So here the word automatism is important, right? Because what he was trying to argue is that instead of trying to find a single origin, psychosis needed to be studied in relation to what he called the formation of a personality, right? So if you think of a personality, the patient's childhood comes into play, the familial structure, the drives and the intentions behind social behavior. So to not think of mental illness as something isolated in the brain, but really as something that is in dialogue and something not necessarily caused by the social, but in dialogue with the social, with others. Lacan's ideas were revolutionary in at least two ways. First, it was a critique of mainstream psychiatry, which was largely focused on brain localization, so trying to find on the brain causes for particular behaviors. For Lacan, psychiatric clinical work needed to open itself to sociological inquiry, to medical examination, but most importantly to psychoanalytic treatment. Indeed, according to Lacan, psychoanalysis was the only discipline that was able to provide a coherent theory of the subject. So for Lacan, for Freud, you could say also, and for the institutional psychotherapy doctors, the subject was really one that emerged, that was constructed in relation to conscious but also unconscious relations or representations of others. So the social was always integral to the subject. The subject could never be taken in isolation, right? But it was also a revolutionary thesis within psychoanalysis itself, because Freud was not exactly clear about whether his talking cure that he had invented just a few years before this would work for psychotic patients, because it was based precisely on transference, on intersubjective transference, and on language. And the case from 1903, where he tries to deal with psychosis with Schreber, he basically says that psychoanalysis is going to be primarily a theory for neurotics, but not for psychotics, where language and transference works. Well, the question is, what does it work? Transference. And so this is where, again, institutional psychotherapy will take up. Lacan's thesis was not exactly rejected by the psychiatric community, but it was essentially ignored. Rather, its champions were the surrealists, who welcomed Lacan's innovative approach to madness and discussed it in their journals. And so what's interesting, this is some of the archival stuff I found at Saint-Alban. You see that they were reading the early Lacan and basically photocopying these things. So you see that there's actually the price on the top of the first photocopy, because you could sell that at the hospital. The patients could buy their Lacan seminars for their free time. And the story we usually get of the Lacan kind of diffusion of his thought is through the Elizabeth Rudinesco, which is, that Lacan's made his way into kind of the public sphere through the Surrealists, the Kojève seminar, Bataille, etc. And this is all true, but I think this is another way to see how Lacanianism comes to permeate the medical world, because they're using some of his concepts in medical journals a lot at this time, and they're also publishing his seminar way before they're published in some ways. Like, this is an example of a seminar that was published in 1998, but it's already circulating in photocopy forms. Now, the second main reference for Tosquelles during these years was a German psychiatrist called Hermann Simon, who had tried to set up in the Gütersloh hospital what he called a more active therapy. And this is, again, his book with the price on top. And you see it was translated by the Saint-Alban doctors and circulated there. Simon realized that his patients were more calm and more lucid when they had small tasks to accomplish, and so he began rethinking the structure of the hospital and built libraries and workshops and promoted a system of what he called of open doors. Instead of focusing on the sole symptom of the individual, he emphasized the importance of treating the whole, the institution, the medical team, the group. And so these are some examples of the kinds of things he was doing at his hospital, and you'll see that some of these come back in the hospitals that I look at, right? Wool work, hay work, this is gardening, and this is the system kind of organizing the daily activities that keep this in the back of your mind, because we'll see this at Laborde later on. So back to Tosquelles. How does he end up at Saint-Alban? Well, the answer here is the Spanish Civil War. Like most Republicans, Tosquelles joined the resistance through the POUM and was sent to the front. It's at the front, when he was trying to figure out how to be most useful, that he decided to set up a therapeutic community to treat the combatants that were traumatized by the war, but also the army officers. So the idea here was that, first of all, that psychiatry could be practiced anywhere, but that also you needed to treat the whole institution, not just the people who were sick, but the community in its entirety. In 1939, in January of 1939, after Franco's final victory, Tosquelles, along with many other Republicans, fled Spain, crossed the Pyrenees, and ended up in one of the many concentration camps that the French government had set up to house these Spanish refugees. So the camp that Tosquelles was placed on is called Setfond, and you see a picture of it from above there. It's in the southwest of France. Living conditions in the camp were dire. The refugees were amassed in overcrowded barracks surrounded by barbed wire, electrical projectors, and surveillance posts. They slept in haystacks with very little wood available for heat and deplorable sanitary conditions. Several of the prisoners died of hunger, disease, exhaustions. Others were driven to suicide. And Tosquelles here was really shocked by the kind of psychological effects that the camp was having. And this is, again, it makes sense because even Freud himself is theorizing all these new illnesses after World War I, right, including trauma. But all these new illnesses emerge in the context of the camp, like barbed wire disease, or one that seems very specific to this region, arenitis, from arena in Spanish, which means sand, because the sand is blowing in your face all the time and kind of making you crazy. So for Tosquelles, he saw this as a concentrationist or carceral environment. And that led him to set up a psychiatric service within the camp, where once again he tested many of his theoretical insights, notably concerning the healing effects of collective projects. So he ends up at this camp, and there's no other doctors with him, so he recruits political activists, artists, musicians to help him organize these activities. But he does have an infirmary with a seal, as you can see up there. And so they start to basically do psychiatry in the concentration camp to try to temper the effects of what they are calling camp psychosis. And so this is a quote from him in an interview. He says, "There was only one psychiatric nurse. The rest were normal people. I think this is one of the places where I conducted very good psychiatry, in the concentration camp in the mud." News of Tosquelles' work in the camp and at the front traveled in medical circles and eventually came to the attention of the director of Saint-Alban, who invited Tosquelles to join his medical team in January of 1940. So Tosquelles arrives in France in Saint-Alban, he's already in France, but he arrives in Saint-Alban in the middle of the war to find yet another form of concentrationism, this time Vichy, the German occupation, and also the humanitarian disaster that I mentioned at the beginning, with basically patients dying massively in hospitals. And so he becomes kind of part of this endeavor to try to keep the patients alive, to not let them die. So all this is the context that gave birth to institutional psychotherapy and that brought together the cast of characters that I study in this book, but all of them had a double conviction. The first conviction was that psychiatry could no longer claim a position of detachment, of objectivity, of pure science, if you'd like, that it had to reckon with its intrinsically political nature. That psychiatry was political, basically. And the second was that the political and the psychic were intimately linked. And this meant at least two things: that when you treated a patient, you also needed to treat his or her social environment. You needed to cure the hospital at the same time as you cured the patient. So the third point is, what did these doctors argue? That's perhaps the hardest question to answer, because there's no definition of institutional psychotherapy, and this will become clear in a second. But this quote by Jean Oury explains, I think, pretty well what they were trying to do. He says, institutional psychotherapy was the act of setting up all kinds of mechanisms to fight every day against that which can turn the whole collective towards a concentrationist or segregationist structure. So what does this mean? According to the practitioners of institutional psychotherapy, we all needed institutions in our life, right? So whether these are social or psychic institutions, so things like political parties, unions, hospitals, schools, but even things like families, right? So the problem with institutions is not that they existed or even that they generate conflict, it's that they have this potential to become concentrationist, authoritarian, hierarchical, stagnant, oppressive. This had become especially clear to Tosquelles after the war, so during his time in the POUM, but also in the front and at the camp. Stalinism, as I mentioned before, was a great example of leftist politics having become concentrationist, authoritarian, anti-democratic. Similarly, the camp didn't have to be this horrifying environment. I mean, the camp was actually supposed to be to welcome the Spanish refugees, not to put them in these kinds of horrible conditions, and yet it was happening. Same thing with the hospital. Why were people dying within the hospitals themselves? So how could we prevent this? One of the main hypotheses of institutional psychotherapy was that alienation was always psychic and social at once. And you see this very clearly in the French term aliéné, alienation, right, which refers to the psychic state, like being mad, the mad are called the aliéné, the insane, but also to the social condition that makes people feel estranged, trapped, or isolated from others. So this double theory of alienation is why Tosquelles referred to Marx and Freud as the two legs of institutional psychotherapy. His idea was that when one leg walked, the other had to follow, right? So that they were complementary references to make sense of the human and of social condition, that you could not think alienation without these two dimensions together, and you could not propose any form of disalienation without those two figures. So in some ways, one question that captures, I think, the goal of institutional psychotherapy is to ask whether psychiatry can imagine, within the confines of the hospital, a philosophy, a social theory, and a clinical practice that could prevent the chronic reappearance of these concentrationisms, of these political and psychic concentrationisms. Can we rethink, rework, and remap institutions to prevent them from becoming authoritarian, hierarchical, stagnant, and oppressive? So this is very abstract, but let me kind of give you some examples of what it looked like on the ground, because I think I'm presenting this as if it was an abstract theory then applied to the practice, and in fact, for them, the praxis and the theory really were co-constituted. The theory emerged from the practice, and the practice the theory shaped the practice, but it wasn't it's not a model. This is why it's hard to give a definition, because it's not a model that can then be exported or cookie cutted and pasted, right? It needed to kind of come from the conditions in which you were working. So to disalienate the patient, the patients, the hospital, the psychiatric profession, but also the community at large, you needed to begin at the level of architecture. So the first step was to demolish the walls of the asylum. There's these videos, this kind of Super 8s, where Tosquelles gives the patients hammers, and they all tear down the walls around the asylum. So the asylum is now integrated into the village. The patients can wander around, the villagers can come by and see them. Similarly, you eliminate the divisions that separate each cell, so everybody sleeps in one big common room like this, and you're no longer kind of attached to your bed because this was the state of psychiatry in the 1840s. It had not changed very much from the 19th century in the sense that patients were literally attached to their bed most of the day with very little mobility and ability to go out. Similarly, they eliminated uniforms and medical blouses so that you could no longer tell who was a doctor, who was a nurse, who was a patient. And again, this had a theoretical purpose because it forced you to, quote, explode fixed roles and to consider the singularity of the patient's illness. Each patient who entered the hospital was welcomed by a committee that was composed of doctors, nurses, and patients who would orient the patient around the castle and explain the logistics of their treatment and of daily life. So this is the kinds of brochure that they were giving, and you see that it looks more like a summer camp kind of brochure than a hospital, but it has the map, the list of activities, the kind of names of the people. If the hospital was to function as a healing collective, it also needed to develop structures to produce or institute a new social. One of the most important innovations was known as the club. And the club was basically like a kind of patient-run cooperative, almost like a union, that was in charge of organizing all the activities within the hospital. The club planned the meals, theater, and music performance, sports, parties, field trips, social activities that were deemed integral to the cure. So these are some examples of posters, again, from Saint-Alban. You see that they were doing things like popular theater, jazz, Afro-Occitan, but there's many of these. There's some other examples. And you see that there's like theater, like in 1 month of July, theater, cinema, parties, pétanque games, et cetera, et cetera. It also ran the library and the different ergotherapy stations. So they had things like pottery, painting, woodwork. This is an example of a painting station. And by the way, some of the artwork that was produced in the hospital ended up making its way to museums and to galleries under the label of art brut, or outsider art. So basically art that was produced outside the confines of the official art world. And this is one example of a patient whose work became quite well known, Auguste Forestier, and you see Tosquelles here with a boat. His sculptures are currently housed at the Collection de l'Art Brut in Switzerland. And the person who was responsible for collecting this work was Jean Dubuffet, who actually traveled to Saint-Alban to meet with Forestier and others. And there's been actually, like this is what I was saying, there's a kind of new editorial life to Tosquelles, but part of it has been through the museums. There's an exhibit that was amazing, that was in Toulouse and Barcelona and Madrid, and is opening in New York in a month. So if you're in New York at the Museum of Folk Art, and it's a really interesting exhibit that tries to think about the relation between surrealism, art brut, madness, and the psychiatric hospitals. So keep your eyes open for that. The club was also responsible for the publication of a weekly journal that was called Trait d'Union, and so these are two examples. And what's interesting is, so it was a collection of texts like theoretical, literary, poetic, drawings, recipes, advertisements, letters, but it also had, again, a kind of theoretical role and a practical role. The idea was that the content was informational, but it was also the act of reading itself got you out of your own head, got you connected to a social world, and this was what they were trying to do. I picked these two because they had editorials by people who were in this talk, Tosquelles and Fanon. I should point, by the way, that all of this was very close in spirit to the POUM that I began with, right? Self-managed, radically democratic, and anti-authoritarian. The idea was to constantly avoid you getting too comfortable, too settled in your own ego, your own identity, your own certainties. One last example, because I think this is actually not from Saint-Alban, but from Laborde, another clinic that was engaged, kind of practiced institutional psychotherapy. It's called La Grille, the grid, and it's something that Félix Guattari wrote a lot about and thought about a lot. So you can see it's a double entry chart with the names of all the kind of staff members and the work that was assigned to him or her each day. And this would rotate all the time. So the idea is that that you would never get too settled in doing the dishes or working in the infirmary or doing the beds or whatever, because you were constantly shifting in your own identity. Guattari called this an instrument of disorganization to avoid the passivity generated by the bureaucratic routine. The grid also presented a forum through which staff members could discuss their feelings, desires, and fears by talking and incessantly questioning all activities and all relationship. So this is the grid, how it looks, and this is how it looks like on the board, basically. And I just want to show you a very short 2-minute clip of a film that came out last year by this filmmaker called Martine Des, where she found the Super 8s of the patients and put them in this movie. And it's a great movie, but there's a moment when you see the club working. So it's really interesting to see kind of like in action.
Je crois pas avoir eu peur de malade. Quand ça allait trop mal, je me tirais mais j'ai jamais mis la camisole à malade, moi.
So that's the castle and that's the club.
Les choses étaient en place au niveau de l'hôpital. Les choses étaient en place, il y avait le club qui s'occupait des activités, 17 personnes qui travaillaient, salon de coiffure, atelier photo, la bibliothèque, l'atelier cinéma, la cafétéria qui tournait avec 2 personnels et des malades qui faisaient tourner la boutique, là, et même avec la chapelle qui y avait à l'hôpital. Monter des chorales pour chanter à l'église. Et il y avait des sœurs là-dedans, elles étaient là, les religieuses. Et puis, c'est le début où les infirmiers partaient déjà en congé. Nous, on a des congés, on part en vacances, et les malades, ils n'ont pas de vacances. Et c'est là qu'on a dit, il faut qu'on fasse des choses. On s'est mis autour de la table, on en a parlé avec les médecins, on en a parlé en bureau du club avec les malades, et c'est là qu'ils ont dit, nous, on a envie aussi. Au niveau du club, quand on faisait nos réunions toutes les semaines, on parlait de tout ce qui se passait, bien sûr. On partait en vacances, on voulait partir en vacances. Et c'est là qu'on a acheté, que Marius a acheté La veille, en tôle.
I mean, I like this passage because the first time I showed it to my students, they were like, of course, it's France, so they're deciding to go on vacation. but the point is that here is that you really see it at work, the way in which anyone could propose an idea, and this is subject to a meeting and a discussion, and it can be realized if possible. Okay, so this is the last section. What is the legacy, or what was the legacy of institutional psychotherapy? From the beginning, institutional psychotherapy had many followers, and so basically what I try to do in this book is to kind of follow some, not all of them, but some of them that were interested in this movement, and that kind of either practiced or kind of were in dialogue with institutional psychotherapy throughout their lives. So one of them is Frantz Fanon, who was a medical student at a medical resident at Saint-Alban in 1952-1953 after he completed his medical studies in Lyon. When he arrived at the hospital, Fanon was already the author of several important works, including Black Skins, White Masks, and several other articles, where he had already been thinking about the question of psychic causality and thinking about the pernicious effects of racism and colonialism on the psyche. The kinds of experiments that Tosquelles and his colleagues had set up in Saint-Alban and the kinds of results they were getting confirmed many of the philosophical hypotheses that Fanon had put forth in his early work on race and racism. In particular, Fanon had argued that the psyche and the social were structurally linked, that colonialism and racism had crucial psychological effects, and that all psychiatry could and should be political. This is one of Fanon's quotes that I like, is when he says, all political leaders need to be psychiatrists, right? So that you always had to think the two together. So here he is, actually, there's a picture of him at Saint-Alban, you see in the middle, and this is the dedication of his book to Tosquelles. It's often hard when you read Fanon to figure out where his psychoanalysis lies. If he's, it's like he's not a Freudian, he's not a Lacanian, but he takes some of these terms. But in many ways, I think he's really a Tosquellian, if anything. Tosquelles had a profound influence on Fanon, who brought the insights of institutional psychotherapy to North Africa, first at the psychiatric hospital of Blida, Joinville. This is him at Blida up here with his team. And then, so he lived in Algeria from 53 to 57, and then at the Charles Nicolle Day Center in Tunisia, where he lived until his death in 1961. Throughout those years, Fanon worked with psychotic patients and wrote about institutional psychotherapy, about its benefits and its limits in the colonial context. So if you are interested in this, there's a fantastic collection of Fanon's psychiatric text that was edited by Robert Young and Jean Calfa, and that, and you really see him kind of wrestling. And this is the part of Fanon, I think, that surprised surprised me at least, because again, Fanon is someone I've been reading since Brown, we kind of knew that he was a psychiatrist, but not the extent to which he was writing psychiatry the whole time and also practicing psychiatry the whole time. At the same time, he got increasingly involved with the Front de Libération Nationale and anti-colonial activism, and wrote his most important political writings, including The Wretched of the Earth, as he was practicing. So I think institutional psychotherapy was really kind of intertwined for Fanon with his political work from a theoretical standpoint, but also at the very concrete level of production. Another example, another early advocate of institutional psychotherapy was Jean Oury, who was a resident at Saint-Alban in 1947 and who in 1953 founded the clinic of Laborde in Courcheverny. Through the 1960s, Laborde became a mythical pilgrimage site for much of the French intellectual world. So it's closer to Paris, so there was a lot of kind of Parisian intellectuals who took the train to Laborde, philosophers, artists, writers, filmmakers, in addition to the medical personnel. So someone who was there, who again you might have heard of, is Fernand de Ligny, the filmmaker and educator who worked with autistic children, and he followed them around and kind of created these artworks, but also made several films. Laborde also provided a home for the philosopher, psychoanalyst, and political activist Félix Guattari, who worked at the clinic his whole life. Oury, Guattari, and their colleagues at Laborde borrowed and adapted many of the Saint-Alban techniques to reorganize the life at the clinic and to imagine new vectors of transference for the psychotic unconscious. And their clinical practice also evolved alongside Lacanian psychoanalysis, and because many of these doctors from Laborde attended Lacan's seminars, so they would take the train each week, apparently get analyzed in the morning, go see the seminar in the afternoon, and come back in the evening. But for Guattari, the type of psychiatry that was performed at Laborde was in perfect continuity with his philosophical activity. All provided different terrains to think through the role of institutions as social and subjective anchors, and to envision them as radically horizontal, anti-authoritarian, and deterritorialized, to use his term. Most famously, perhaps, Guattari explored the intersections of the psychiatric and the philosophical in his magnum opus written with Gilles Deleuze, Anti-Oedipus, which was published in 1972. One of the guiding hypotheses of Anti-Oedipus was that alienation was always social and psychic at once, and the term they use in this book is Oedipalization, but Oedipalization is a form of double alienation in some ways, right? That entraps your desire and channels it towards the safe route of the heterosexual reproductive family. It was not only so Oedipalization for them did not just configure social relations, it was also a state of being, a form of psychic renunciation to the plenitude of desire. So it's in this sense that Michel Foucault referred to Anti-Oedipus as a book of ethics. He writes the preface, and I think this is a really beautiful way to frame it. He says, I would say that Anti-Oedipus is a book of ethics, the first book of ethics to be written in France in a long time. Being anti-Oedipal has become a lifestyle, a way of thinking and living. How does one keep from being a fascist, even especially when one believes oneself to be a revolutionary militant? How do we rid our speech and our acts, our hearts and our pleasures of fascism? How do we ferret out the fascism that is ingrained in our behavior? So I think for him, this idea of ethics, I think, works really well with institutional psychotherapy, not as a model, but as a kind of practice of everyday life that needs to be rethought all the time. Being anti-Oedipal was a lifestyle, a way of thinking and living, just as institutional psychotherapy presented itself as a practice of everyday life. So I think this gives us a good transition to return to my initial and final question, why should we care about institutional psychotherapy today? I think many of the psychoanalytic notions that were put forth by institutional psychotherapy can still be helpful to us today, not just to understand fascism in its historical manifestation, so because, right, they were dealing in some ways what you could say with a real fascism, right, of Hitler, of Franco, of Mussolini, of Vichy France, but to understand what Foucault describes in this preface as the fascism in our heads, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. Right? And I think when I was writing this book, I showed you this picture, but I could also show you this picture, which was on my mind because it was during I thought it was an image of the past, but now who knows? But in some ways, I was struck by the fact that so much of the commentary on Trumpism and kind of the rise of authoritarianism was stuck between these. On the one hand, a kind of liberal approach that would say it's a failure of rationality, it's a kind of political pathology, and on the other hand, a kind of vulgar Marxism that talked about, this is a false consciousness, a displacement for a real social or economic reality. But neither of these diagnoses could take into account the very desire that was motivating these crowds, not just the negative desire, but the productive desire, the positive desire, jouissance even, to use Lacanian's word, for authoritarianism, racism, misogyny, or the identificatory power that figures such as Donald Trump were able to foreground, or the kinds of fantasies that may not have been true, but that still had real political effects. So in this sense, I think that institutional psychotherapy might have something useful to add to this conversation, this political conversation, by foregrounding first the role of the unconscious in all group formations. So any group, right, of all these pictures, there is not a collective unconscious, but we have to think about the unconscious dimensions of the groups. And second, the collective dimension of all subjective developments, right? All of us have an unconscious that is also shaped by social developments. For institutional psychotherapy, the unconscious was not simply an add-on or a supplement to the social theory, but rather the basis for the transferential process, the vector through which individuals and collectives could explore fantasies, conflicts, and desires. Ultimately, the unconscious was the means by which the group could avoid closing on itself. And the idea here was that even if the carceral environment of psychiatric hospitals or concentration camps could be transformed into spaces of psychic healing and renewed communal bonds, then all institutions, right, political parties, unions, schools, could function similarly if they were treated with care. To produce a collective was to produce its conditions of possibility, to work through the effects of transference, counter-transference, resistances, and power with constant vigilance. In other words, the goal was to disalienate alienation, but it wasn't once and for all. It was a kind of, you never got to the end, right? In the words of Jean Oury, and this is also a formula I like very much, in French it was ne pas en laisser passer une, to never let one go. The minute you think you have it, in fact, you're just starting over again. So thank you so much.
So thanks so much. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
I guess I just have a question about the relationship between the psychiatrist's experience of this practice and the patients, or what was being created for the patients to inhabit in institutional psychotherapy. Because it seemed to me toward the end, in some of your descriptions of Guattari and the quote from Foucault, I mean, you have this highly theoretical, I mean, they're living a practical philosophy, but they're living it with a kind of theoretical reflection, it seems, right? But in the description of the situated institutions, it seemed different. It seemed more like, a world was being created that would be healing and therapeutic. Yeah. And I just wonder if you could maybe just say a little something about whether that there was a kind of distinct difference there, or whether there are ways in which the self-reflective theoretical elements were also brought to bear within the institutional settings. It sounded like maybe they were. Okay.
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I guess the answer is that the self-reflective elements were brought to bear to were supposed to be experienced by the patients too. Of course, the problem is I have no way of assessing that. I wish I did in some ways, but in some ways I think that would have been a different project. It would have been more of a kind of social history of the patients at Laborde. But I think what's interesting. So I didn't have access to any patient files or anything, so I don't know how it worked. But I think that the idea was to precisely use these practical experiments to, in some ways, shape the patients. That the theory would shape them in some ways, but also that the theory would emerge from them. But it's also, I mean, I think here it's also their understanding of psychosis was a kind of Lacanian understanding of psychosis. So, in the sense that it's not like they were not going to be psychotic at some point. So the notion, even any notion of kind of healing, is complicated in this, or cure. Is complicated because the cure involves, I mean, the way that they are most explicit about it is that they say that they want the patients to be kind of independent, or to be able to be, enunciate their own laws, so to be less assisted. But it's not like they're going to, not be psychotic anymore, especially if you have a kind of structural understanding of that. So to have the kind of the delusions, the symptoms be milder, and for them to kind of be able to inhabit a social world, because what part of their diagnosis is that so much of the suffering of psychosis is a social isolation. So I think there's some of that, but I think, but it's a very, you're totally right. It is, it is like there is a kind of modernist philosophical hubris in some ways of like the doctors coming to work with the patients to, even though again I think they would say in their defense that the theory was not imposed, that it comes from them. Yeah.
Hello. So one of the things that sort of first strikes me is the possibility for this structure to become the very monster that it set out to destroy.
Of course.
So what sort of dialogue or commentary did these thinkers put out there with regards to, I hate to use this word, but almost like selection criteria for what constitutes diseases that should be eradicated from society?
Yeah.
So that way they don't end up harming, just something that, a person that's just different, but not harmful to society.
Wait, so the last part, I got the beginning part, but the last part is more like how would they...
So with regards to, I guess you can say, structuring their interface or their dialogue with political institutions, insofar as the psychiatry exists to modulate that which is neurotic or that which is psychotic, but doing so in a way that doesn't falsely accuse different individuals as such.
Yeah, okay. I thought you were going to go somewhere else, but I think so they didn't have. I mean, one of the starting hypotheses, and this is why I mentioned Georges Canguilhem, is that psychosis, it's complicated. So that psychosis is another form of life. It is like, so they're not there to, the whole point is that, again, they're not there to kind of pathologize psychosis, to cure it, but they're also not romantic about psychosis in a way that they say, so this is an important point, is that they say they're not anti-psychiatry, and they're very clear about the distinction between anti-psychiatry and institutional psychotherapy, partly because anti-psychiatry, one of the things they did is they wanted to get rid of institutions, not keep them, but getting rid of institutions, closing down hospitals, so Basaglia, Cooper, and Lambe in Britain, right? So, and because partly is that the institution is the space that's going to be is the source of oppression, right? But also that there was they thought that there was a kind of romanticism, like someone like Lang with Mary Barnes, right? The kind of the psychotic patient who had inner visions and stuff like that. For them, that was just not right. Especially Oury and Tosquelles insisted on this, and in fact, Oury thought that Guattari was a bit too much on the romanticizing of psychosis with schizoanalysis and things like that. That. Which is complicated, but anyway, because I don't. But they kind of disagreed on this question. So they insisted on the fact that there was a medical specificity to psychosis, and that was important to them. They were doctors, so they didn't hesitate to even use medicine, neuroleptics, even electroshocks. So they were comfortable, but the question is that they always said it shouldn't become what Oury said is a veterinary science. The point is, what's important is to use the medicine as complements to the social therapy. And then, for example, in the case of the electroshock, what's really important is the moment of waking up. So that is when you can really do some kind of, I don't know because I'm not a clinician, but apparently you can do some interesting clinical work in that space. But I thought where you were going to go with the question at first was more like, how would you avoid the kind of possibility of this becoming a monster, like of themselves becoming what Oury says, a small kingdom, right? And I think they weren't, they were aware, but they thought in some ways it would work itself out, right? That the endless, and that's also something that that kind of troubled me in the book, because at the end of the day, they were all male doctors, they were all white, they were all, and so the person I think who can kind of help us, give us some guidance here is Fanon, who's interesting because Fanon basically takes institutional psychotherapy to Algeria, starts to practice it there, and realizes that it actually doesn't work with his Algerian patients. It's working really well. He has a pavilion of white women and a pavilion of Algerian men. It's working really well with the white women, and it's not working with the Algerian men. And part of and he writes this fascinating piece where he says, kind of like, I was doing the monster, I think that you were talking, and he doesn't say that word, but he says, that I was doing an imperialist psychiatry, using this as a kind of model, instead of rethinking it from the particular context in which you're working. So, I don't think they all were as reflexive as Fanon in some ways as they were, but that was definitely something they were thinking about. But I'm not sure that they necessarily succeeded,
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering if you could say a little more about transference. What I understand, especially in terms of how it would have played out on the social level in Saint-Alban, as well as perhaps how it could play out today. From what I understand of it right now, it's to do with repressed material in the unconscious coming to the conscious, or a patient transferring their thoughts or desires of the desired object onto the psychiatrist.
Exactly.
So I was wondering how that worked in the social realm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great question. It's so Freud's theory of transference is that, as you explained it very well, so that you would play out, or you would relive, or talk at least about certain dynamics, say from your childhood, through the figure of the analyst, right? And so it's a one-on-one relationship that is mediated through language, because language is the only tool you have to talk about it, right? So, so again, in the case of psychotics, Lacan will say that the signifier has a hole in it. So there is the kind of the problem of referentiality in psychosis is at the key. The problem of referentiality is at the key of psychosis, meaning that. I mean, this gets us into kind of technical details, but essentially that words, the signifier and the signified, are not attached at all, right? They're kind of free-floating. So that is partly why you can't have psychosis. You can't have a transference with psychotic patients, according to them, on a one-on-one clinic. Their theory, so I can tell you what their theory is. I don't know how it works, but I've tried to ask my psychoanalytic and psychologist friends, because I'm just a historian. But apparently the idea that they had was that, in fact, psychotics did have transference. It's just that it was, the word they use is burst or collective transference, so that the transference was much more collective. So that this is why they did all these social experiments, right? So you could, for example, have in a meeting like this, one could have a transference with like several people in the group, but also with a chair or a coat. I have no idea how it works, but I have asked again people who are clinicians, and they have told me like, oh, yeah, but if there's other clinicians in the room who want to weigh in, please do. But they've told me things like yeah, I can imagine how that would be helpful or something like that. But the idea was to, you know, Oury is the one who really wrote most about psychosis as a kind of clinical problem. Part of it was the mirror stage in Lacan, when you like see yourself in the mirror and you see that the image is whole and you don't feel whole, and it's sad. But in neurosis kind of comes out of that disappointment, this misidentification. But in psychosis, the drives are just floating. So part of the group, the effort here is to kind of bring in the drives, to try to so this is what I can get from, but this is as much as I can understand without. But that's why they did so much, this is their big kind of, in some ways, insight. And this is why all of these, like even the little clip I showed you, in some ways you could say that was a form of transference, right? The meeting, the collective, and the answering back the question. So it's the same psychoanalytic techniques, just used as a kind of in a group.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to ask about the word horizontality came up a few times, and it seems to me that horizontality is kind of maybe the opposite of institutions in some ways. I mean, I was just like looking up the etymology, and it's like institutions literally meaning like to stand up, right?
Right.
And so, what's so striking about this history, right, is that it is in some ways like almost like I don't want to say like a failed utopian project, but it has a kind of, it sort of undoes itself in certain kinds of ways. And I guess the question is, can you ever have a horizontal institution? Mm-hmm. And how were they sort of reconciling or sort of grappling with that question of horizontality within a kind of institutional milieu? Yeah.
No, that's exact. I think that's exact. I think you put really well what they're struggling with. Especially, I think the person who tries to really bring these insights into the political work is Guattari, because this is in the aftermath of May '68, and he has this notion of institutional analysis. So taking institutional psychotherapy outside of the setting of the hospital and using it for politics, and he starts like 1 million groups. Partly is they don't last because of that, because it's really hard to keep the horizontality all the time. They have, he starts journals too. He starts, like, for example, Recherche, which is it's a journal without an editorial board, without a particular line of publishing. So it is definitely utopian, it is definitely tiring, and it is definitely, but in some ways I think part of them is, the question of longevity is interesting because I think they would say that the non-longevity is part of it, that it has to retransform itself into something else, that is part of the horizontality. I mean, I ended, the way I was thinking about it at the end of the book was also kind of putting this in dialogue with all of these movements of political activism that people who are much younger than me today have started, but even things like Occupy or Nuit Debout or whatever, that we're always accused of not having a program. but I think a lot of these groups, not all, but some of them were really, really conscious about these questions of power, like who could speak, how to speak, trying to find mechanisms to stay horizontal, even though they would, often be recuperated as vertical or institutionalized. But I think that is the challenge. And their answer is to say it's through the unconscious and through all these notions that you would avoid doing that. It has to be instituted again and again and again.
Thank you for this great talk. I'm struck first by the parallelism between the scene of the vacation getaway and the hospital break in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And,
Right.
the juxtaposition of these two films, and what that says about two very different institutional settings. But I actually wanted to go back to the last question you posed and ask you a question that I myself always dread, so I apologize for asking it of you. I mean, I think the implications of your story for the contemporary political scene are so persuasive. I wonder what you think this story tells us about psychiatry today, and specifically whether there is a place for the brain, for biology in the project of disalienation. Because sometimes it seems like these two stories run in parallel, and we, the historians, the social scientists on one side, the anthropologists, psychiatrists on the other, especially post DSM-3 and everything else. So would welcome your reflections on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think on the psychiatric front, I certainly wasn't it wasn't like a victorious movement, in the sense that I think psychiatry, like in the United States and France, is more and more heading towards a neuroscientific, biological essentialism, understanding of the brain, of which pill is going to solve which problem. So and I think psychoanalysis is even more marginalized, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for not good reasons. I think psychoanalysis did a lot of harm to itself also. And certainly French psychoanalysis and its discussions of autism and this and that. So there is. The psychiatry as a field, I don't think, is going to recover this. But I will say that what's been interesting is that, one of the things that's interesting about them is that they are not, as I said before, it's not anti-psychiatry. They're not cultural constructionists, in the sense that they don't think that mental illness is a pure kind of social construction, that if you just can find the right, close down that institution or change this, you'll somehow be not psychotic. So the question is, again, thinking about the interaction of the two, the biological, the neurological, if you want, and the social. And what's been interesting as I've been working on this project is to meet younger clinicians and psychiatrists and psychoanalysts who are again, this small group of them, but who are reading these people. Oury has not been translated in English very much, but Guattari is, and things like transversality, and who are finding in these experiments something to work with, and that I found really exciting, because I've sort of become involved in these webs of reformist psychiatrists and psychoanalysts, and I think around, for example, certainly around Black Lives Matter, but now even the war, like the thought of Fanon has really come back with the psychiatric writings of Fanon have also come back. There's a lot of interest in thinking about the psychological effects of racism and the question of disalienation. So I think there are these kinds of pockets of hope out there, not necessarily as a discipline as a whole, but certainly I think if you wanted to do these kinds of reformist work, it's certainly, there's still no cure for there's still no pill that solves schizophrenia. There's still no mapping of the brain that will find it. So instead of focusing on trying to come up with a single origin, perhaps some of these healing techniques will help some people.
That was a great talk. Thank you. I think, like Jenny, I found myself thinking about the bus scene in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Sorry, I hadn't even thought of that, but that's I had the same. One association and then one specific question. This very specific question is you use the term experiments a few times, and I wonder what you meant by experiment as opposed to case study, as opposed to mode of treatment. It seemed like it was a very particular usage of experiment, so I was wondering what you meant by experiment. And then the other is that I found myself thinking, as you were speaking about Freud's group psychology, about crowd psychology, about, which has a particular lineage in French thought, but then Freud himself, and then particularly when you went to the scene of Trump, about an article by another historian of psychiatry, Liz Lundbeck, that was both an annotation of group psychology, but then interspersed images of Germany in the 30s and 40s with Trump rally images. But it was sort of, again, a similar gesture to how do we think about this relationship. And so I just would ask you to think about the historical lineage, whether that strain of Freud's thought filtered through and was part of the conversation, and then, I'm throwing out a piece you may or may not have read, but any of Lundbeck's reflections
I
there.
did read Lundbeck's piece. That's great. I think, I don't know, they were very close readers of Freud, but I haven't seen as much, I think the one who really thought about the group dynamics was more Guattari than all of them. I mean, Tosquelles to some extent, but it was really Guattari who tried to kind of take these insights into, and he was not such a careful reader. I mean, he is a careful reader of Freud, but I think it's more mediated through the Lacan, so it's like less, I haven't seen, I mean, I'm trying to think of an anti-Oedipus, there's references to the Freud group psychology. There's certainly to Reich and people like that who are working with the kind of question of trying to bring Freud and Marx together. But I would say that unlike the Frankfurt School, where there was still, I think, a possibility, a kind of revolutionary horizon out there. Here, the alienation is kind of constitutive, right? Because again, it's kind of the constitutive moment of subjectivity. So you're not going to not get disalienated at some point. So I would say that. But I think the psychoanalytic notions are more. I think that what they're trying to say is, or at least what Guattari tries to say, is that we cannot think any political movements, any group movements, without the help of these categories, right? And Lambe was a good attempt to do this. When psychoanalysis was used at the time, it was mostly to kind of diagnose, a kind of sociobiological, like to diagnose Trump as a narcissist or this, that. This is more like, how do we use these notions to prevent the group from becoming fascistic, right? And fascistic understood in a broad, like in the Foucault's definition of a group closed on itself. So, which is again poses kind of ethical questions because they do explode the category of fascism, right? It's not. I don't think it's all the same fascisms, but that's the idea, right? That they're working with. An experiment, it's the word they used a lot, but I think it is because it was so tentative, it was what worked and what didn't. So it wasn't systematic case studies or something that you could rely on. They didn't really publish that. It was, Oury's writings are just like, super abstract kind of conversations with Lacan and, like psychosis, like and graphs and images and stuff, or but it's, or kind of more like anecdotal stuff, but it's not grounded in a kind of case study model as much as like the Freudian cases.
Kind of jumping off of this question about the possibility of like a horizontal institution and what that can and can't do for us, and then thinking about this like one response of Guattari moving into like all the more institutional space. And on the other hand, Deligny like going to the woods. Yeah. And like doing this like alongside sort of thinking as opposed to, bear with me. So there's that. And then there's also this kind of like this context of 68, right? And like the revolution that does nothing. And that makes me think about, I guess like a leotard version of like this like figure of impotence or sterility where like, oh, well, the whole point is it doesn't do anything. Yeah. Which has always confused me in its Frenchness. And so I'm wondering how much of like, if there's like a historical line that gets drawn of, okay, so we have this great experiment, we see the ways that it's self-defeating. Do we just turn towards defeat as somehow like the new dialectic thing that where we don't say productivity, but then gesture to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think that there's like a hidden question in there about language. Also in that split between the Delaney and the Guattari and like,
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, yeah, the way you put it is again, right? Like, so you either build the kind of bunker in the institution and try to reform it from within, which is Guattari's approach, or you follow, or you go to the woods, the Cevennes, like Deligny, and you know, he called it ligne d'air, like you literally follow the children around. But Deligny was also quite critical of institutional psychotherapy. I mean, he stayed at Laborde for a little bit, but I wouldn't call it, he thought this was, you know, psychiatry sympa, like kind of like nice psychiatry that called itself reformist, but in fact they're doing electroshocks. So they also had a huge fight with the anti-psychiatrists, because there was also a kind of French version of anti-psychiatry that was born out of '68, and a group that actually Foucault was quite involved with, the group called the GIA, which was modeled on the GIP, so the prison workers, so the hospital patients taking control and speaking up, and they also thought that Laborde and Saint-Alban were just basically like psychiatry that called itself more humane, but in fact remained totally enamored to the monsters and the kind of position of the doctor as all-knowing. And Foucault himself had a very kind of complicated relationship to all this. But yeah, so I think that's exactly right. That is the kind of crossroad they're in. The '68 revolution is huge, obviously, for Guattari, right, and Deleuze. It's the inspiration for anti-Oedipus. It's not so much that, and they say it's not so much that it didn't do anything, it was that it was aborted, is the word they use. And it was aborted because they say all of a sudden there was a kind of eruption of desire in society, and the workers decided to settle for better wages and better work conditions, horror, instead of taking, the revolution to its logical consequences, and this is why they write, and they say it's because they had Oedipus. Right. So Oedipus is what's blocking your desire. I don't know what Guattari imagines the solution is. I have no, it's like, it would be like what the kind of ultimate consequence of a non-aborted revolution would be, but it would be something, it's certainly, certainly an anarchistic dimension to it. And that is, and for them, but I think for me what's interesting is that the '68 revolution failure leads them to also a rethinking of Marxism, right? It's not like the point is not just to acquire the means of production, because that's happened in a lot of countries at that point, and there's still ideology. So we need to think about the systems of reproduction. And of course, they're writing at the same time as Foucault, Althusser, ISAs, they're all trying to think about the question of reproduction, and they're all turning to the psyche in different ways. Again, not necessarily to the unconscious, because, well, Althusser kind of does too, but Foucault is more about the subjectification, but there is still this kind of idea of why it is that that you continue to demand to your own oppression or to subject yourself, the kind of will of subjection.